Fellow Sadzaitas, it's been a while since I gave you guys a detailed update on current affairs. But what a month it's been in Zimbabwean politics. In my last update, a Constitutional Bill number 3 had just been gazetted, and I explained in detail how the Zimbabwean Constitution is amended. Remember, we are currently in the 90-day consultation phase, which is expected to end on May 17. And what is the purpose of this 90-day consultation phase? Well, the purpose is to allow ordinary Zimbabweans to participate and give their views on the content of the bill. A parliament organizes and leads this process. It is supposed to be non-partisan and inclusive. The problem, however, is that the ruling ZANU-PF party controls parliament. It has a 2/3 majority in the National Assembly. It is also influential in the Senate. And by the way, let me break down the Zimbabwean Senate for the benefit of those who might not really understand it. The Zimbabwean Senate has a total membership of 80 senators. 60 of them are elected via a proportional representation. 18 are chiefs, the traditional leaders. And the other 2 are for the disabled. That makes a total of 80 senators who make up the Zimbabwean Senate. Now, ZANU-PF got 33 Senate seats in the last election. The other 27 went to the CCC. But as we all know, traditionally, ZANU-PF has always had a huge influence over traditional leaders. So they are likely to vote in favor of ZANU-PF. Moreover, the only opposition party in parliament, the CCC, is largely influenced by a man who has publicly declared his support for the proposed amendment bill. So you can be sure that a significant portion of CCC members in parliament will vote in favor of ZANU-PF. And while the consultation process is being led by parliament as required by the constitution, the problem is the parliamentarians who are running these consultation meetings are interested parties. They stand to benefit if this bill becomes law, because it seeks to give them an extra 2 years on their current term. Talk about a conflict of interest. Do you really expect them to accommodate the views of people who are opposed to this bill? It is therefore not surprising that the process has been very chaotic. In fact, chaos is an understatement. On 1 March, opposition leader and constitutional lawyer, Professor Lovemore Maduku, was assaulted by unidentified men in his own offices, where he had gathered with colleagues to discuss the bill. On 21 March, another opposition leader, Tendai Biti, and his colleagues were arrested in Mutare for simply holding public meetings to discuss the bill. Then, on the 31st of March, we all saw the disturbing visuals of human rights lawyer Douglas Coulthard being assaulted in full view of cameras and hundreds of people who had gathered to give their opinions to the bill. Douglas also had his spectacles broken and his phone stolen, live on camera. The people who assaulted him were clearly pro-ZANU-PF in their rhetoric and stance. Not only that, opposition figures such as Tendai Biti, Jameson Timber, Fadzai Mahere, and Lovemore Maduku, who attended the public hearing on the 31st of March, were not allowed to speak. A similar situation happened the previous day in Bulawayo, where former MP and human rights defender Gift Ostalo Siziba was also denied the opportunity to express his views. The ruling ZANU-PF party has also been accused of busing its supporters around the country to control and dominate discussions at these public gatherings. Now take a look at this. This is a directive reportedly issued by a ZANU-PF district chairman in Mashonaland East. The directive banned all church activity on the 29th of March so that everyone could attend a ZANU-PF meeting addressed by this man: Daniel Garwe, the Minister of Local Government and also ZANU-PF Provincial Chairman for Mashonaland East. So while opposition figures are being assaulted and their activities restricted, ZANU-PF is allowed to go about its business freely. Hardly what you would call an inclusive and non-partisan process. So as a result, leading opposition figures like Tendai Biti, Ngarivume, Maduku and others have now decided to disengage from the process. They are now considering peaceful demonstrations. But you can be sure that there will be a heavy-handed response from the authorities. But is there anyone who still believes that President Mnangagwa is not interested in remaining in office beyond 2028? Remember, he is the one who chaired the cabinet meeting which approved this amendment bill. Is he still trying to persuade the persuaders? And if ED gets the extra 2 years that he so desperately wants, do you really think that he's going to gladly and willingly hand over power to someone else in 2030? Well, fellow Sazaitas, slay queens and bingers, socialites, papalites, cinemalites, warkujgarais, never cinemarites. Welcome to the special report. Now, for the benefit of those who might not know what this bill is all about, please allow me to summarize it. What is ED actually trying to change in the current constitution? Well, in simple terms, if this bill becomes law, there won't be any elections in 2028. As you may know, the current term of President Mnangagwa expires in 2028. The term of parliament also expires in 2028. This is because in Zimbabwe, presidential terms are tied to the life of parliament. So under the current constitution, there must be elections in 2028 to elect the president, the parliament, and also local government. 3 separate elections held at the same time. We call them harmonized elections. Now, what this bill seeks to do is to add 2 extra years to the president, parliament, and local government so that the next elections will be held in 2030. From then onwards, one presidential term will now be 7 years, a shift from the current 5 years. The bill also seeks to change how the president is elected. There will no longer be direct presidential elections. Instead, Zimbabwean presidents will now be elected by parliament. That means you vote for parliamentarians, and then parliamentarians will then vote for the president in parliament. And how will this happen? Well, remember, the Parliament of Zimbabwe has 2 houses. You have the House of MPs, better known as National Assembly, and also the House of Senators, better known as a Senate. So the plan is that after a general election, all MPs and senators will gather in one room to elect the president. This election will be presided over by the Chief Justice. And to win this election, a presidential candidate must get more than 50% of the total membership of Parliament. The bill also seeks to remove the restriction on traditional leaders and allow them to be openly political, even though we all know that many of them already are. The other proposed changes are that the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission will no longer draw electoral boundaries. A new commission will be created to handle this. The Zimbabwe Electoral Commission will also no longer manage the voters' roll. The Registrar General will now handle this. The other proposed change is to give the president power to appoint judges without the need for public interviews. In theory, he will do this in consultation with the Judicial Services Commission. But in reality, we are the army, we are the police, we are the CIO, we are the judiciary. The other proposed change is to give the president power to appoint the prosecutor general without consulting anyone. Moreover, the president will now have the power to appoint 10 extra senators. Remember, I said the current Senate has 80 members. 60 are elected via proportional representation. 18 are chiefs, and the other 2 represent people with disabilities, making a total of 80 senators. The president will now have the power to appoint 10 more on top of those 80. Now, this is very important because senators are part of the people who will elect the president. So that means before the election even begins, ED already has 10 votes. Now, I say ED because I don't believe that ED will give up power in 2030. I hope I'm wrong. In fact, I pray that I'm wrong. The other big change being proposed is how the president will be replaced if he is removed, resigns, or dies. The current constitution says that the replacement comes from the political party to which the outgoing president belonged. For example, in 2017, when Robert Mugabe was forced to resign, ZANU-PF wrote to the speaker advising him that E.D. Mnangagwa was its preferred candidate to replace Mugabe. That is how E.D. became president. But if this bill becomes law, the president's replacement will now come from Parliament. An election in Parliament will be held within 30 days to elect the new president. Now, of course, this feels like it's giving Parliament a power. And in many ways, that is true, except for one thing. You can't give power to an institution that is controlled by someone somewhere. In fact, giving a captured parliament a power is actually making the people who captured it more powerful. Giving power to parliament only works if that parliament has the ability to make independent decisions without influence from the rich and powerful. By the way, I actually don't have anything against the idea of parliament choosing the president. There is nothing inherently wrong with parliament choosing the president. After all, in the first 10 years of Zimbabwe's independence, there were no direct presidential elections. The first 2 elections held in Zimbabwe in 1980 and 1985 did not have direct presidential elections. Zimbabwe used to have a parliamentary system at that time, where the head of state was a ceremonial president and the leader of government was an executive prime minister who was effectively running the country. Both these 2 leaders were not chosen directly by the people. So, not having direct presidential elections is not new to Zimbabwe. In fact, having a president elected by parliament has its own benefits, because it means such a president is wholly accountable and answerable to Parliament. Such a president only holds power for as long as Parliament is happy with him. Once Parliament loses confidence in him, zvaendwa. So in theory, a president elected by Parliament is much easier to remove than a president directly elected by the people. The only problem, however, is that our Parliament does not always make independent decisions. It is controlled by the powerful. So when you say you are giving power to Parliament, you are simply saying you are making those who control Parliament more powerful. Zimbabwean MPs are among the lowest paid in the region. This makes them vulnerable to pressure and bribes. Parliament will simply be used as a tool to legitimize and formalize a decision made by the untouchables. We can look at China as an example. China is a one-party state, and the ruling party decides who becomes president. After that, a parliament votes, but this is mostly a formality. Parliament simply confirms what the party has already decided. Yes, on paper there is a vote, but in practice, the decision would have already been made earlier. A similar situation could develop in Zimbabwe, where Parliament simply approves what powerful figures have already agreed. The difference, of course, is that the Chinese model is deliberate, because China is a one-party state. Zimbabwe, on the other hand, is legally not a one-party state. Now, supporters of this constitutional bill argue that removing direct presidential elections will reduce the toxicity and the political violence associated with our elections. However, this argument weakens when you consider two facts. Firstly, in the first 10 years of Zimbabwe's independence, there were no presidential elections. Yet, that is the period when the darkest hour in Zimbabwe's political history happened. The Gukuraundi, where an estimated 20,000 people were massacred by the government. Gukuraundi aside, the 1980 elections were disputed, yet there were no presidential elections. Clearly, the toxicity and political violence in Zimbabwe was not brought by direct presidential elections. Secondly, those who support Constitutional Bill number 3 claim that the last 2 years of any presidential term are unproductive due to the election mode that would have engulfed the country. Yet, they propose giving President Mnangagwa an extra 2 years, extending his term from 2028 to 2030. Now, if these people admit that the last 2 years are unproductive, then giving President Mnangagwa an extra 2 years contradicts that logic. You complain that the last 2 years of any presidential term are wasted in campaign fever. Yet, you want to give those 2 years to President Mnangagwa. If the last 2 years are worthless, then why give them to ED? Clearly, you have established that nothing will happen in those 2 years. They are worthless. So why waste them on President ED? Unless, of course, if the goal isn't really productivity. Maybe the goal is power. If they truly wanted to extend terms to 7 years for project continuity, they could start after 2028. Not by adding 2 years right now, which they themselves suggest would be unproductive. In short, their reasoning undermines itself. They argue that the country has been stuck in election mode for the last few years, and that's part of the reason why they want to amend the constitution. But they ignore the fact that this election mode is entirely self-inflicted. It's a ZANU-PF internal issue, not caused by the opposition. The opposition in Zimbabwe has been dormant since the last election. The political tension we have witnessed in the last few years has been driven by factionalism within ZANU-PF itself. So, will letting Parliament pick the president certainly solve the toxicity of our national elections? What does internal ZANU-PF factionalism have to do with national elections in the first place? It's a power issue, ladies and gentlemen. It's got nothing to do with removing toxicity or bringing stability. But again I ask, if President Mnangagwa manages to extend his stay in office until 2030, do you honestly think that he will gladly and willingly hand over power to someone in 2030? Well, whatever happens, I'll be here to marinate you with all the details without fear or favor, because on this platform, we say it as it is. And as always, thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoy the content, please like and share.